Blood pooling on pristine white linoleum is a site emergency room nurses learn to ignore, but the metallic scent clinging to the frantic men bursting through the trauma bay doors was entirely different. It smelled vividly of fresh gunpowder and notoriously expensive cologne. A small boy lay limp in the arms of a man whose impeccably tailored suit was ruined by a massive, spreading crimson stain. The man wasn't crying. His eyes were cold, dead, and fixed on the trembling medical staff. "Fix him," he commanded, his gravelly voice promising absolute violence. This wasn't a standard gunshot wound. This was a mob hit gone wrong. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped hornets, casting a sickly pallor over Trauma Room 3. Sarah Collins wiped a streak of sweat from her forehead with the back of her forearm, careful not to contaminate her gloves. At 26, she was drowning in a sea of medical school debt and working double shifts at Boston Memorial Hospital just to keep her cramped apartment from going into foreclosure. She was exhausted, her bones aching with the kind of fatigue that coffee could no longer touch. But fatigue vanished the second the double doors blew open. 4 men in dark suits stormed in, pushing past security as if the guards were made of paper. The air in the room instantly grew heavy, suffocating. At the center of the phalanx was Silas Moretti. Even in the chaotic blur of the ER, Sarah recognized him. Everyone in the city knew who Silas Moretti was, even if the police could never make anything stick. He was a phantom who controlled the docks, the unions, and the underground casinos. Tonight, however, he was just a desperate father. In his arms was a boy no older than 7, his pale face smeared with dirt and his own blood. "I need a doctor!" Silas roared, the sound vibrating against the glass cabinets. "Now!" Dr. Richard Evans, the senior attending on duty, froze. He was a brilliant diagnostician, but a coward under physical pressure. When one of Silas's men, a hulking enforcer with a scarred jaw named Dante, pulled back his jacket to reveal the grip of a Glock 19, Dr. Evans literally took a step backward. "We need to clear the room," Dr. Evans stammered, his hands shaking as he looked at the bleeding child. "Sir, you have to leave so we can work." "I am not going anywhere," Silas snarled, laying the boy gently onto the trauma gurney. "His name is Luca. He took a bullet to the abdomen. If he dies, everyone in this room dies with him. Do you understand me?" Panic is a contagious disease, and it swept through the trauma bay in seconds. 2 junior nurses backed away, tears welling in their eyes. "Doctor," Evans stared at the massive amount of blood soaking through the makeshift pressure bandage applied to the child's stomach, completely paralyzed by the threat on his life. Sarah didn't think. She just moved. Shoving past Dr. Evans, she snapped a fresh pair of latex gloves over her hands and vaulted up onto the stool beside the gurney. "Get out of my way, doctor," she barked, her voice cutting through the hysteria like a scalpel. She didn't look at Silas, didn't acknowledge the armed men flanking the doors. Her entire world narrowed down to the small, fragile body on the table. "Heart rate is dropping rapidly. Pressure is tanking," Sarah announced to the frozen room. "He's in hypovolemic shock. I need 2 large-bore IVs. O-negative blood, uncross-matched, hanging now. Push EPI." When nobody moved, Sarah finally looked up, her green eyes blazing with fury. She pointed directly at Dante. "You, big guy, put pressure right here hard. Don't let up unless I tell you to." Dante blinked, taken aback by the sheer audacity of the tiny nurse in scrubs. He looked at Silas for permission. Silas, his jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from granite, gave a sharp nod. Dante stepped forward and pressed his massive hands over the gauze. Sarah grabbed the shears and cut away the rest of Luca's ruined shirt. The entry wound was just above the right hip, a through and through, but it had nicked an artery. Blood was welling up too fast to see the bleeder. "I need suction," Sarah yelled, grabbing the wand herself when the tech fumbled it. She cleared the blood, her fingers digging mercilessly into the wound cavity to find the source. Luca whimpered, a weak, heartbreaking sound. "I know, baby, I know," Sarah murmured, her voice suddenly incredibly soft despite the chaos. "I've got you. I'm right here." Silas watched her. He watched the way her hands, steady and covered in his son's blood, worked with brutal efficiency. He watched how she commanded a room of paralyzed professionals through sheer force of will. "Got it!" Sarah clamped the artery. The immediate geyser of blood slowed to a sluggish trickle. "Dr. Evans, I clamped the bleeder, but he needs a surgeon right now to repair the damage and check the bowel. Call the OR. Tell them we are coming up." The spell broken, Dr. Evans scrambled for the phone. For the next 45 minutes, Sarah didn't leave Luca's side. She rode the gurney into the elevator, manually pumping the ambu bag when his breathing grew shallow, ignoring the intimidating presence of Silas Moretti standing mere inches away from her. The Mafia boss didn't say a word. He just watched her. When they finally handed Luca over to the surgical team behind the swinging doors of OR4, the adrenaline abruptly abandoned Sarah's body. Her knees buckled. She hit the floor, her back sliding against the cold, tiled wall, her scrubs stained red. A shadow fell over her. Sarah tilted her head back. Silas Moretti was towering over her. Up close, the danger radiating from him was palpable. His dark eyes locked onto hers, analyzing her, as if stripping away her layers to see the machinery underneath. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't offer a thank you. "What is your name?" he asked softly. "Sarah," she breathed out, too exhausted to be afraid. "Sarah Collins." Silas stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. Then he simply turned and walked away, his men falling into step behind him. Sarah closed her eyes, thinking it was over. She had done her job. She had saved a boy. She didn't know she had just sealed her own fate. 3 days passed. The news of the shootout in the financial district dominated the local broadcasts, attributing the violence to escalating tensions between the Moretti syndicate and the rival Falco family. At the hospital, whispers about the night Silas Moretti took over the ER ran rampant. But Sarah kept her head down. She washed her scrubs, worked her shifts, and tried to ignore the suffocating weight of her reality. That reality hit her hard on a rainy Thursday morning. Sarah returned to her dilapidated apartment building in South Boston after a brutal 14-hour night shift. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and damp carpet. Pinned to her door, fluttering lightly in the draft, was a bright pink notice. Eviction warning. 48 hours to vacate. Sarah tore the paper down, her hands shaking. She unlocked her door, walked into the cramped kitchen, and let out a dry, broken sob. Between her mother's lingering medical bills from a lost battle with cancer and the predatory interest rates on her student loans, Sarah had been drowning for years. Now, the water was finally over her head. She opened her mailbox, pulling out a stack of final notices, but paused when she saw a thick, unmarked black envelope at the bottom. Frowning, she sliced it open. Inside was a cashier's check, made out to her name. The amount made her drop her keys. $100,000. There was no note, no return address, just a staggering amount of money that could wipe out her debts and secure her home. Before her brain could even process the windfall, a sharp knock echoed through her apartment. Sarah froze. She didn't get visitors. Slowly she walked to the door and peered through the peephole. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Dante, the hulking man whose hands she had commanded just 3 days prior, her heart hammered against her ribs. She cracked the door open, leaving the chain engaged. "What do you want?" "Mr. Moretti requests your presence," Dante said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the doorframe. "I'm off the clock," Sarah said firmly, trying to hide her terror. "If Mr. Moretti wants to thank me, the check was well. It's too much. But the message is received." "I can't accept this." She held up the envelope through the crack. "It's not a thank you," Dante replied, his face devoid of emotion. "And it's not a request. Please unchain the door, Miss Collins." The quiet menace in his tone left no room for negotiation. Trembling, Sarah undid the lock. Dante escorted her down the stairs and into the back of a waiting armored SUV. The drive took them out of the gritty streets of the city and into the sprawling, heavily wooded estates of Weston. The vehicle pulled through massive wrought-iron gates, crunching over a circular gravel driveway before stopping in front of a modern fortress made of glass, steel, and dark stone. Sarah was led inside, her cheap sneakers squeaking against imported marble floors. Dante ushered her into a massive study lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Behind a heavy mahogany desk sat Silas Moretti. He looked rested, deadly, and entirely in control. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to a leather chair across from him. Sarah remained standing. "I want to go home. I don't know what you think this is, but I saved your son because it's my job. I don't want your money, and I don't want to be involved with your business." She tossed the black envelope onto his desk. Silas didn't blink. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Luca woke up yesterday. The surgeon said if you hadn't clamped that artery exactly when you did, he would have bled out on the table." "I'm glad he's recovering," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Now let me leave." "You misunderstand the situation, Miss Collins," Silas said, standing up. He walked around the desk, his presence overwhelming the large room. "I investigated you. Sarah Collins, orphaned 2 years ago, drowning in debt, facing eviction, a brilliant nurse, but terribly alone in the world." Sarah crossed her arms defensively. "My financial situation is none of your concern." "It became my concern," Silas murmured, stopping just inches from her. "When I dug into your background, I found something interesting. Your late father, Thomas Collins, had a severe gambling problem. He borrowed heavily from a man named Victor Drago, the head of the Falco family." Sarah's blood ran cold. "My father is dead." "But his debt isn't," Silas corrected smoothly. "Drago doesn't forgive debts. He just waits for the interest to compound. He was planning to collect from you, Sarah, next week, and I assure you, Drago's collection methods don't involve eviction notices. They involve shipping crates and human trafficking." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. The room spun slightly. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Silas said, stepping back and picking up the black envelope from the desk, "which is why I bought your father's debt from Drago yesterday morning. You no longer owe the Falco family." Sarah looked at him, horror dawning. "You bought it. So now I owe you?" "Yes," Silas said simply. "You saved my son's life, and in return I saved yours. But I do not let loose ends walk away, and you, Miss Collins, are now a very valuable asset. Drago knows who you are. He knows you saved Luca. You have a target on your back just by being associated with me for those 45 minutes in the hospital. What do you want from me?" she whispered, terrified of the answer. "Luca's recovery will be long. He needs round-the-clock medical care, and he is terrified of strangers. But he remembers the woman with the green eyes who held his hand," Silas stated, his tone shifting from mob boss to fiercely protective father for a fraction of a second. "You are going to move into this house. You will be his private nurse. You will be protected, your debts will vanish, and you will want for nothing." "And if I refuse," she challenged, finding a shred of defiance, "I have a life. I have a job at the hospital." Silas's eyes hardened, stripping away any illusion of choice. "You no longer have a job at the hospital. They received your resignation this morning. Your apartment has already been packed up. You belong to the Moretti family now, Sarah. You can walk out that door if you choose, but Victor Drago's men are waiting at the end of my driveway. The choice is yours." Sarah stared at the terrifying man before her, realizing the trap had been set and sprung before she even knew she was playing a game. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, bound by blood, debt, and a Mafia boss who refused to let her walk away. Sunlight streamed through the bulletproof floor-to-ceiling windows of the Western estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the Brazilian walnut floors. Sarah Collins stood in the center of a bedroom larger than her entire previous apartment, her hands clasped tightly in front of her scrubs. The space was a paradox, decorated in warm, childish tones of navy and gold, yet entirely dominated by the cold, sterile hum of state-of-the-art medical equipment. It looked like a VIP recovery suite at Brigham and Women's Hospital, ripped from the city and dropped into a Mafia fortress. On the center of the massive king-sized bed lay Luca. He looked incredibly small, engulfed by down comforters and an ocean of pillows. The color had returned to his cheeks, but the dark circles under his eyes spoke of night terrors and trauma. He stared blankly at a cartoon, playing silently on an 80-inch television, his small fingers plucking aimlessly at the edge of his blanket. Silas Moretti stood by the door, a silent sentinel. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. A silver Patek Philippe watch caught the morning light as he crossed his arms. He hadn't spoken since Dante had escorted Sarah up the grand staircase. "He hasn't spoken a word since he woke up," Silas finally said, the gravelly edge of his voice catching slightly. It was the first crack in his armor Sarah had ever witnessed. "Dr. Aris from Mass General examined him yesterday. Physically, the anastomosis is healing flawlessly. Neurologically, he's intact. But psychologically, he is locked away." Sarah took a slow breath, forcing her heart rate to settle. She was a captive. Her life had been hijacked, her debts weaponized against her, and a ruthless crime lord was currently her jailer. But looking at the broken child on the bed, her nursing instincts, the very core of her identity, overrode her terror. "Trauma-induced mutism," Sarah murmured, stepping forward. "It's a defense mechanism. His brain experienced something too horrific to process, so it built a wall." Silas's jaw tightened. "Break the wall down, Miss Collins. That is why you are here." Sarah stopped and turned to face him, her green eyes flashing with a sudden, reckless defiance. "I am a nurse, Mr. Moretti, not a battering ram. You cannot order a child's mind to heal just because you have money and a gun. Healing requires safety. And frankly, this environment," she gestured to the heavy mahogany door where Dante stood guard outside, "screams anything but safe." A heavy, dangerous silence descended upon the room. Silas uncrossed his arms, taking a slow, predatory step toward her. The air pressure seemed to drop. "You forget your place, Sarah," he warned, his voice dangerously soft. "My place is to advocate for my patient," she fired back, refusing to break eye contact even as her knees trembled. "If you want him to speak, you have to leave. Your anxiety, your anger, he feels it. You are vibrating with the need for vengeance, and Luca knows it. Let me do my job." For a terrifying 10 seconds, Sarah thought Silas might actually strike her. The dark, violent energy radiating from him was palpable. But then, to her absolute shock, the Mafia boss gave a curt, tight nod. "You have 2 hours, Silas commanded. "If you need anything, press the intercom." He turned on his heel and strode out of the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. Alone with the boy, Sarah let out a shaky exhale. She walked over to the bed, ignoring the monitors for a moment, and pulled up a plush velvet armchair. She didn't try to touch him or force him to look at her. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a small, worn deck of playing cards. "I hate hospitals," Sarah said casually, shuffling the cards with a soft, rhythmic flick. "They smell like bleach and bad coffee. When I was your age, I had to stay in one for 2 whole weeks because my appendix burst. Do you know what an appendix is?" Luca didn't move, but his eyes flicked away from the television, tracking the movement of her hands. "It's a useless little pouch in your tummy," Sarah continued, seamlessly bridging the gap between medical professional and comforting presence. "Mine decided to explode. It hurt a lot, just like your tummy hurts now. The worst part wasn't the pain, though. It was the quiet. The doctors only talked about me, never to me." She began laying the cards out on the edge of his mattress in a simple game of solitaire. "My dad taught me this game. He wasn't a perfect man, but he knew how to make the quiet go away." For an hour, Sarah simply sat there, playing cards and talking into the void. She told him about her chaotic shifts in the ER, about the time a patient brought a live parrot into the waiting room, and about her favorite clam chowder stall near Faneuil Hall. She wove a blanket of normalcy, wrapping it around the traumatized boy. Slowly, infinitesimally, Luca's rigid posture relaxed. His breathing deepened. When Sarah paused to check his IV line, gently inspecting the insertion site on the back of his small hand, she felt a tiny pressure. She looked down. Luca's fingers had curled around her wrist. He looked up at her, his dark eyes, so hauntingly identical to his father's, swimming with unshed tears. "It was loud," Luca whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "The bad men, they were so loud." Sarah's heart shattered. She carefully placed her other hand over his, offering warmth and a physical anchor. "I know, sweetie. I know it was loud, but you're safe now. I promise you." "Are you going to stay?" he asked, a desperate plea hidden in the fragile question. Sarah thought of the eviction notice, the black envelope, and the armed guards patrolling the perimeter of the estate. She had no choice but to stay. But looking at Luca, she realized she wouldn't leave even if the doors were thrown wide open. "I'm staying right here, Luca," she promised softly. "I'm not going anywhere." On the other side of the bedroom wall, standing in the darkened surveillance room, Silas Moretti watched the interaction on a high-definition monitor. He heard his son's voice for the first time in a week. A tightness in his chest, a knot of guilt and terror he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge, finally loosened. He watched the way Sarah stroked his son's hair, her face glowing with genuine, uncalculated empathy. She was a liability. She was a civilian dragged into a bloody war. But as Silas watched her soothe his only child, he realized Sarah Collins was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous to him, a necessity. 3 weeks bled into one another, establishing a strange, fragile rhythm within the Western estate. Sarah's world contracted to the boundaries of the property. She spent her days managing Luca's physical therapy, regulating his pain medication, and slowly coaxing the vibrant, intelligent boy back to the surface. To the outside world, she was a ghost. Her cell phone had been confiscated and replaced with an encrypted device that only allowed calls to Silas, Dante, and the estate's head of security, a sharp-eyed former Mossad agent named Elias. The dynamic between Sarah and Silas was a powder keg of unresolved tension. They circled each other like 2 different species forced into the same enclosure. Silas was rarely home during the day, consumed by the violent fallout of the Falco family's assassination attempt on Luca. But in the evenings, he would return, shedding his suit jackets and the scent of the underworld to sit quietly in Luca's room. It was during these quiet evening hours that the lines began to blur. One particular Tuesday night, a fierce nor'easter slammed into the Massachusetts coast, battering the estate with sheets of freezing rain and howling winds. The storm had caused a brief power surge, unsettling Luca and making him feverish. Sarah had stayed by his side until midnight, reading him passages from Treasure Island until the boy finally slipped into a deep, medicated sleep. Exhausted, Sarah quietly slipped out of the bedroom, intending to head to her own suite down the hall. "He's finally asleep," Sarah gasped, spinning around. Silas was leaning against the mahogany wainscoting in the dimly lit corridor. He looked wrecked. His tie was gone, his collar open, and a smear of dark grease, or perhaps dried blood, stained the cuff of his white shirt. His knuckles were bruised, the skin split and raw. "Yes," Sarah whispered, her eyes drawn instantly to his injured hands. His temperature spiked slightly from the stress of the storm, but the Tylenol brought it down. "He's resting comfortably." Silas pushed off the wall, moving with a heavy, predatory grace. He stopped mere inches from her. Up close, the scent of him was intoxicating, a mix of rain, expensive scotch, and a dark, dangerous masculinity that made Sarah's pulse race for entirely the wrong reasons. "You look exhausted," Silas noted, his dark eyes mapping the faint shadows under her eyes. "I'm fine," she lied automatically. She gestured to his hands. "You're bleeding. You need to clean those cuts before they get infected." Silas looked down at his ruined knuckles as if he hadn't noticed them. "It's nothing. An occupational hazard." "It's a staph infection waiting to happen," Sarah corrected, her professional instincts overriding her intimidation. "Come to the secondary medical room. Let me clean them." It wasn't a request, and to her surprise, Silas didn't argue. He followed her in silence to a smaller room down the hall that had been converted into a sterile supply closet and examination space. Sarah directed him to sit on the exam table. She washed her hands, snapped on a pair of black nitrile gloves, and gathered gauze, antiseptic, and steri strips. When she turned back to him, Silas was watching her with an intensity that made the small hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Give me your hands," she ordered softly. He held them out. Sarah took them in hers. His hands were massive, rough, and calloused, the hands of a man who built empires through violence. Yet, as she dabbed the stinging antiseptic onto his split skin, he didn't flinch. "Victor Drago knows you're here," Silas said suddenly, the quiet words dropping like a bomb into the sterile room. Sarah's hand froze mid-air. She looked up, her green eyes locking onto his dark ones. The air in the room instantly chilled. "What do you mean?" "We intercepted a communication this evening," Silas explained, his voice devoid of emotion, though a muscle feathered at his jawline. "Drago's men were tracing the sale of your father's debt. They figured out why I bought it. They know you were the nurse in the trauma bay. They know you saved Luca." Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at Sarah's throat. "Are they coming here?" "They wouldn't dare attack this estate directly. It's too heavily fortified," Silas said, leaning forward slightly. The proximity forced Sarah to catch her breath. "But they are looking for a weakness. They view you as a vulnerability, a way to hurt me." "I'm not your weakness," Sarah stammered, stepping back slightly, dropping the bloody gauze into a biohazard bin. "I'm your employee, your hostage." Silas stood up, his towering frame completely dominating the small room. He closed the distance between them until Sarah's back was pressed against the stainless steel counter. He reached out, his uninjured hand coming up to gently cup her jaw. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "You ceased being just an employee the moment my son smiled at you," Silas murmured, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a dark, possessive heat. "And you are not a hostage, Sarah. You are under my protection. I will burn Boston to the ground before I let Victor Drago touch a single hair on your head." The intensity in his eyes was terrifying, yet incredibly intoxicating. For her entire life, Sarah had been the caretaker, the responsible one, the woman left to drown in the mistakes of others. Never before had anyone looked at her and promised to set the world on fire just to keep her safe. Her breath hitched. She should have pushed him away. She should have reminded him that he was a criminal, a monster who dealt in blood and fear. But as she looked up at Silas Moretti, she saw the raw, desperate man beneath the monster. Slowly, Silas lowered his head. He gave her every opportunity to pull away, his dark eyes questioning, waiting for a rejection. When Sarah remained frozen, her lips parted in a silent gasp, he closed the final inch. His lips brushed against hers. It wasn't a brutal or forceful kiss. It was surprisingly gentle, a hesitant exploration of a boundary they were both terrified to cross. Sarah's eyes fluttered shut. A low groan rumbled in Silas's chest, and the kiss deepened, his hand sliding to the back of her neck to pull her flush against his solid chest. It was a kiss that tasted of danger, of secrets, and of a desperate, forbidden hunger. Suddenly, a loud, shrill alarm shattered the moment. The lights in the medical room flickered and died, instantly replaced by the eerie, pulsing red glow of the estate's emergency lockdown system. A mechanical siren wailed through the hallways, loud enough to wake the dead. Silas broke the kiss instantly, the gentle lover vanishing, replaced by the lethal syndicate boss. He shoved Sarah behind him, his hand reaching smoothly under his jacket to draw a custom matte black Sig Sauer P 226. The heavy door of the medical room burst open. Elias, the security chief, stood in the doorway, an assault rifle strapped across his chest. "Perimeter breach at the south gate," Elias barked over the siren. "3 heavily armed vehicles. They bypassed the outer sensors. It's a full-scale assault, boss. It's Drago." Silas's eyes went dead, completely devoid of the warmth they had held seconds ago. He looked back at Sarah, who was trembling against the counter. "Go to Luca's room," Silas commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Lock the steel security door from the inside. Do not open it for anyone but me or Dante. Do you understand?" "Silas," she choked out, terrified for the boy, and terrifyingly for the man standing in front of her. "Go!" he roared. Sarah didn't hesitate again. She sprinted out of the medical room and down the dark, flashing hallway, plunging headfirst into the bloody reality of the Mafia war she could no longer escape. Adrenaline, sharp and metallic, flooded Sarah's veins as she sprinted down the pulsing red corridor. The wail of the siren was deafening, a mechanical scream that vibrated in her teeth. Behind her, the heavy thud of tactical boots and the terrifying rhythmic pop-pop-pop of suppressed automatic weapons echoed from the grand foyer. Victor Drago's men weren't just probing the defenses. They had breached the inner sanctum. Sarah threw her weight against the heavy mahogany door of Luca's suite, her hands scrambling for the biometric lock panel Silas had shown her on her first day. She slammed her palm against the glass scanner. A mechanical voice chirped over the siren, and a 3-inch thick, reinforced steel barrier slid seamlessly from the wall, sealing the room with a final echoing clank. The noise of the siren was instantly muffled, leaving the room in a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the boy's frantic breathing. Luca was sitting bolt upright in the center of his massive bed, his eyes wide with a terror that ripped straight through Sarah's chest. The monitor beside his bed beeped furiously, registering a skyrocketing heart rate. "Sarah!" he cried out, his voice cracking. "The loud men! They came back! I'm here, Luca, I'm right here!" Sarah rushed to the bed, sliding onto the mattress and pulling his trembling body into her arms. She tucked his head under her chin, shielding him. "You are safe. The door is locked. Your dad built this room like a vault. Nobody is getting in." "Where is my dad?" Luca sobbed, his small fists gripping the fabric of her scrub top. "He's making sure the bad men leave," Sarah lied smoothly, though her own heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She thought of Silas, standing in that hallway with nothing but a handgun against men carrying assault rifles. The memory of his lips on hers, the desperate, protective heat of his kiss, flashed in her mind, making her stomach twist with a sickening knot of fear. "I will burn Boston to the ground before I let Victor Drago touch a single hair on your head." A massive explosion shook the floorboards, knocking a framed vintage map of Massachusetts off the wall. The glass shattered across the Brazilian walnut floor. Luca shrieked, burying his face deeper into Sarah's chest. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, her clinical mind racing. An explosion inside the house. C4 or a breaching charge. She gently pushed Luca back onto the pillows. "Luca, look at me. Look right at my eyes." The boy blinked through his tears, finding her steady green gaze. "We are going to play a game, okay? We are going to build a fort. The best fort ever. Master wow." Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, stripping the heavy down comforters and thick pillows from the bed. She dragged them into the narrow space between the solid oak armoire and the reinforced exterior wall, the safest corner in the room, away from the door and the bulletproof windows. She nestled Luca into the makeshift bunker, grabbing her emergency trauma bag from the closet. She unzipped it, her fingers brushing over the quick-clot combat gauze, tourniquets, and epinephrine auto-injectors. She was a nurse. If the worst happened, she would fight for this boy's life with everything she had. For 20 agonizing minutes, the muffled sounds of a war zone raged outside the steel door. The staccato bursts of Heckler and Coke MP5S clashed with the heavier, deeper booms of tactical shotguns. Sarah sat with her back against the armoire, holding Luca's hand, singing a soft, tuneless lullaby to drown out the sound of men dying in the hallways of the estate. Then the gunfire abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the explosions. It was heavy, pregnant with a terrifying uncertainty. Sarah held her breath, her eyes fixed on the steel door. A heavy, wet thump sounded against the metal. Then a fist pounded a specific rhythm. 2 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. It was the all-clear code Silas had established. Sarah's hands shook as she stood up. "Stay right here, Luca. Do not move." She crept towards the biometric panel and pressed her thumb against the scanner. The heavy steel barrier retracted with a hiss. The copper scent of fresh blood hit her instantly, thick and gagging. Standing in the doorway was Dante. The hulking enforcer looked like he had been dragged through a meat grinder. His custom suit jacket was shredded, and a massive, blooming crimson stain covered his left shoulder. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, a customized Glock 17 dangling limply from his right hand. Behind him, the hallway was a nightmare of shattered glass, bullet-pocked drywall, and darkness. "Dante!" Sarah gasped, rushing forward to catch him as his knees finally buckled. Despite his massive size, she managed to guide him to the floor, leaning him against the wall inside the room. "Perimeter! Secure!" Dante grunted, his face pale and shining with a cold sweat. "Drago's men are dead or retreated. Elias is sweeping the grounds." "Where is Silas?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising in panic as she ripped open Dante's ruined shirt to expose the gunshot wound. It was a clean through and through to the anterior deltoid, but it was bleeding heavily. She grabbed a wad of sterile gauze from her bag and pressed it hard into the torn flesh. Dante winced, his jaw clenching. "He's downstairs. He sent me to guard the door. We had a rat, Sarah. The outer gate protocols were bypassed from the inside. A capo named Dominic Russo. He disabled the thermal cameras." Before Sarah could process the betrayal, a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the hallway. Silas Moretti stepped into the light of the bedroom. Sarah let out a choked breath. He was a terrifying sight. His white dress shirt was completely ruined, soaked in dark, drying blood that she prayed wasn't his own. His face was a mask of cold, absolute murder, his dark eyes devoid of any human warmth. He held a combat knife in his left hand, the serrated edge dripping onto the floorboards. He looked past Sarah, his eyes immediately finding Luca, who was peeking out from the pillow fort. The instant Silas saw his son was unharmed, the lethal tension radiating from his body fractured. He dropped the knife, the weapon clattering loudly against the wood, and fell to his knees beside the makeshift bunker. "Luca," Silas breathed, pulling the boy into a fierce, desperate embrace, heedless of the blood on his clothes. "I've got you. They are gone." Sarah watched the ruthless Mafia boss bury his face in his son's hair, his broad shoulders shaking slightly. She pressed harder on Dante's wound, her own tears finally spilling over her lashes. The gilded cage had just been torn open, revealing the horrific, bloody reality of the world she was now inextricably bound to. The library on the first floor had been transformed into a makeshift triage center. The smell of expensive leather and old paper was completely overpowered by the sharp tang of iodine, bleach, and copper. Sarah worked with mechanical precision under the harsh glare of a halogen work lamp Elias had brought in from the garage. She had already stabilized Dante, packing his shoulder wound with hemostatic gauze and administering a heavy dose of IV antibiotics and morphine. He was currently passed out on a Chesterfield sofa in the corner. Now, her attention was solely on the man sitting rigid in the high-backed leather chair in the center of the room. Silas had taken a grazing bullet to the ribs, a vicious, jagged laceration that had torn through his obliques and required immediate suturing. He had stripped off his ruined shirt, his heavily muscled torso exposed to the cool air of the library. His skin was marred by a map of old, faded scars, telling a silent history of violence that Sarah tried desperately to ignore. "Hold still," Sarah murmured, her hand steady as she threaded a curved needle with 3-0 proline suture. Silas didn't flinch as the needle pierced his flesh. He hadn't made a sound for the last 20 minutes. His jaw was locked, his dark eyes staring blankly at the bullet-shattered window across the room. He was physically present, but his mind was deep in the dark, strategic trenches of a mob war. Dominic Russo was with my family for 15 years, Silas suddenly spoke, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated against Sarah's hands. He ate at my table. I paid for his daughter's tuition at Boston College. Sarah pulled the suture tight, tying off a neat surgical knot. People do terrible things when they are desperate or greedy, she offered quietly, snipping the excess thread. Dante said Drago bought him. Drago didn't just buy him, Silas corrected, his eyes finally shifting to meet hers. The coldness in his gaze made her breath hitch. Drago threatened his family. But in this world, Sarah, understanding the motive doesn't change the consequence. Treason is an absolute. Dominic opened the gates. He let monsters into the house where my son sleeps, where you sleep. Sarah swallowed hard, wiping the dried blood from Silas's side with a saline-soaked sponge. What happens now? Now the shadow war is over, Silas stated, his muscles flexing as he leaned forward slightly. Drago crossed the final line. By tomorrow night, the Falco family will cease to exist. I am going to rip Drago's empire apart, piece by piece, and then I am going to put a bullet between his eyes. He said it with the casual certainty of a man discussing the weather. It was a stark reminder of exactly who and what Silas Moretti was. He wasn't just a protective father. He was an apex predator. Sarah taped a thick, sterile dressing over the sutured wound. You need to rest. You lost blood, and the adrenaline crash is going to hit you hard. Silas reached out, his large hand wrapping gently around her wrist, stopping her movements. He looked down at her hands, her pale, delicate fingers stained with his blood and Dante's. You didn't run, Silas said softly, the lethal edge in his voice melting away, replaced by something entirely different. A raw, vulnerable awe. When the alarms went off, you didn't hide. You built a bunker for my son. You stood your ground. He's my patient, Sarah whispered, her heart kicking into a dangerous rhythm as Silas's thumb stroked the inside of her wrist. He's more than that to you, and you are more than just a nurse to us. Silas pulled her slightly closer, forcing her to step between his spread knees. The proximity was intoxicating, drowning out the horrors of the night. I brought you here by force, Sarah. I used your debts to chain you to this family. It was a ruthless calculation to save my son. I know, she replied, her voice trembling slightly as she looked down into his dark, magnetic eyes. But tonight changed the equation, Silas continued, his other hand coming up to cup her hip, anchoring her to him. Drago knows you survived the breach. He knows you are vital to Luca, and he knows what you are becoming to me. You are no longer safe here as an employee. Panic flared in Sarah's chest. Are you sending me away? You said if I left, Drago's men would kill me. I will never send you away, Silas vowed, his grip tightening almost painfully on her hip. But I cannot protect you just as a civilian caught in the crossfire. The syndicate, the men who follow me, they only respect one thing: blood and oaths. Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the gravity of his words. What are you saying, Silas? Silas stood up, wincing slightly as his bruised ribs protested the movement. He towered over her, his presence utterly overwhelming. He reached over to the side table and picked up a heavy, antique gold ring bearing the Moretti family crest, a roaring lion holding a broken sword. I am saying that the only way to make you untouchable in this world is to make you a Moretti, Silas declared, his voice dropping to a fierce, possessive whisper. Marry me, Sarah. The room spun. Sarah took a step back, hitting the edge of the leather sofa. Marry you? Silas, you can't be serious. This isn't a business transaction. You can't just arrange a marriage to solve a security issue. It started as a security issue, Silas admitted, closing the distance between them again, his eyes blazing with a dark, undeniable heat. But when I was bleeding out in that hallway, listening to the men trying to break down the door to get to you and my son, business was the last thing on my mind. I was terrified, Sarah. For the first time in my life, I was absolutely terrified of losing something I didn't know I needed. He gently took her left hand, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. I know I am a monster to the rest of the world, Silas murmured, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. I know my hands are covered in blood, but I swear on my life I will spend my last breath keeping you and Luca safe. I cannot let you walk away. I won't. Sarah closed her eyes, tears leaking past her lashes. She should run. She should demand to be smuggled out of the city, given a new identity, a new life away from the gunfire and the death. But as she felt the steady, powerful beat of Silas's heart against her chest, she realized the terrifying truth. She didn't want a new life. The gilded cage had become her sanctuary, and the monster holding the key had captured her heart. Okay, Sarah breathed, opening her green eyes to meet his. I'll stay. I'll marry you. Silas let out a jagged breath, sliding the heavy gold ring onto her finger. It was cold, heavy, and permanently binding. He didn't hesitate this time. He crushed his mouth against hers, kissing her with a desperate, claiming hunger that tasted of blood, gunpowder, and an unbreakable vow. The poor nurse from South Boston was dead. In her place stood the new matriarch of the Moretti Syndicate, stepping willingly into the crosshairs of a Mafia war. Rain lashed against the towering limestone facade of the Rosecliff Mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, serving as a bleak backdrop for a wedding forged in desperation and blood. Inside the opulent ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast a warm, deceptive glow over the small gathering of syndicate capos and trusted lieutenants. Sarah Collins stood in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection in an antique, gilded mirror. She wore a custom silk Vera Wang gown, its elegant, sweeping train a stark contrast to the leather tactical holster strapped to her upper thigh, holding a compact 9mm Kimber Micro. She was no longer just a nurse fighting eviction in South Boston. The heavy, antique gold ring of the Moretti family sat like a crown on her left hand. Downstairs, Silas was executing the final phase of his war. While the remaining heads of the New England syndicates gathered to witness the union, a powerful display of stability, Elias and a heavily armed strike team were simultaneously raiding Victor Drago's primary compound in Providence. The wedding was both a vow and a perfectly orchestrated distraction. You look beautiful, Sarah, a small voice echoed from the doorway. Sarah turned, her tense shoulders instantly dropping at the sight of Luca. He was dressed in a miniature black tuxedo, his dark eyes bright and entirely devoid of the traumatic haze that had clouded them weeks ago. Beside him stood a man in a crisp white medical coat, holding a small silver tray. "Thank you, sweetheart," Sarah smiled, crossing the room to kneel before the boy, adjusting his bow tie. "Time for his pre-ceremony medication, Mrs. Moretti," the man said smoothly. He had been introduced an hour ago as Dr. Harrison, a private pediatric specialist flown in from Johns Hopkins to monitor Luca's vitals during the high-stress event. Silas had spared no expense, demanding top-tier medical oversight while Sarah was preoccupied with the ceremony. Dr. Harrison prepared a syringe, drawing a clear liquid from a small, unlabeled vial, just a mild sedative and an anti-inflammatory to ensure he doesn't experience any abdominal cramping from the excitement. Sarah stood up, her clinical instincts flaring instantly. The hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention. I wasn't informed of any change to his medication schedule. His anastomosis is fully healed. He doesn't need a sedative. Mr. Moretti insisted on absolute precaution, Dr. Harrison replied, his smile remaining perfectly fixed, though his eyes were cold and dead. He reached for Luca's arm, uncapping the needle. Sarah's eyes darted to the syringe. The liquid inside was slightly viscous, catching the light in a way that standard saline or Toradol did not. Furthermore, The man was holding the syringe with a full-fisted grip, a rookie mistake no seasoned physician from Johns Hopkins would ever make. "Stop," Sarah commanded, her voice slicing through the quiet suite. She stepped between the doctor and Luca. "What exactly is in that vial?" Dr. Harrison's smile vanished. The polite facade crumbled, revealing the hardened face of a Falco hitman. "Something to send Silas Moretti, a wedding gift he will never forget." Before the assassin could lunge, Sarah moved with a speed born of pure, unadulterated instinct. She didn't scream for security. She didn't cower. She grabbed the heavy crystal vase from the vanity table and smashed it directly against the side of the man's skull. The assassin staggered with a grunt of pain, the syringe clattering to the floor. He recovered quickly, pulling a suppressed pistol from beneath his white coat, his eyes blazing with lethal intent. Sarah shoved Luca behind the heavy velvet drapes. "Hide!" she screamed, her hand diving under the slit of her silk gown to grip the handle of her 9mm. She drew the weapon, dropping to one knee just as the assassin raised his gun. Two suppressed shots tore through the air, shattering the mirror behind her and sending a cascade of glass raining down on her shoulders. Sarah didn't hesitate. She aimed center mass and pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the Kimber echoed through the opulent suite, drowning out the string quartet playing softly downstairs. The assassin jerked backward, a blooming red stain appearing on his chest, and collapsed onto the Persian rug. The door to the bridal suite burst open. Silas tore into the room, his bespoke tuxedo jacket flying open, his own weapon drawn. Behind him, Dante and 3 heavily armed guards flooded the corridor. Silas's eyes frantically scanned the shattered room, skipping over the bleeding body of the assassin and locking onto Sarah. She was still kneeling, the gun smoking in her trembling hands, her white gown dusted with broken glass. "Luca!" Silas roared, sheer panic stripping away his lethal composure. "I'm here, Dad!" Luca scrambled out from behind the velvet drapes, running straight into his father's arms. Silas crushed the boy to his chest, closing his eyes as a shuddering breath ripped through his lungs. He looked up at Sarah, taking in the dead man on the floor, the syringe lying just inches from her silver heels, and the unyielding fire in her green eyes. "He was a plant," Sarah said, her voice shaking but her grip on the gun steady. "He tried to inject Luca with an unknown agent. I stopped him." Elias, the security chief, stepped into the room, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked at the dead assassin, then at Silas. "Boss, the raid in Providence was a success. Victor Drago is dead. But it seems he left a contingency plan." "A plan that failed," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifyingly calm register. He handed Luca to Dante. "Take him downstairs. Keep him surrounded." Once the room was cleared, Silas walked over to Sarah. He gently took the hot weapon from her hands, engaging the safety and tossing it onto the vanity. He didn't say a word about the blood on her hands or the violence she had just committed. Instead, he reached out and brushed a shard of broken crystal from her cheek, his thumb lingering on her soft skin. "You saved him again," Silas whispered, his dark eyes swirling with a mixture of reverence, awe, and an all-consuming possessiveness. "You saved us." "I told you," Sarah replied, stepping into his chest, letting the scent of his cologne and the solid wall of his muscles anchor her to reality. "I am not walking away. I am not letting anything touch this family." Silas wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. The war was over. The Falco Syndicate was ash, and the man who had brought a city to its knees was entirely captive to the woman holding him. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The dangerous mob boss replaced entirely by a man irrevocably in love. "Then let us make it official, Mrs. Moretti," Silas murmured, his lips brushing hers. "Let's go get married." Hand in hand, stepping over the glass and the blood, the Mafia king and his fiercely protective queen walked out of the suite, ready to claim their empire together. Blood washed away the debts of her past, forging a terrifying but beautiful future she never could have anticipated. Sarah Collins had walked into the Boston Memorial Hospital as an exhausted, impoverished nurse, desperate to survive another shift. She walked out of the Rosecliff mansion as the untouchable matriarch of the most powerful crime syndicate on the East Coast. The gilded cage she had once feared had transformed into an impenetrable fortress of loyalty, respect, and unconditional love. Silas Moretti, a man feared by entire cities, had laid his empire and his heart at her feet, proving that even the darkest souls can be illuminated by the right light. They were bound not just by a heavy gold ring, but by the scars they shared and the sun they protected together. In a world defined by ruthless violence, Sarah became the ultimate cure, and the Mafia boss finally found his peace.